My name is Rachel Dawson, and when I was 19 years old, my sister stood in the backyard of our family home in Charleston and tossed every single one of my college books into a fire pit. The smoke curled into the humid night air while I screamed and begged her to stop, but she only smiled with that cruel satisfaction that has haunted me ever since. Those books were not just paper and ink to me. They were my lifeline, the hours of waitressing and saving change. The hope that education could carry me out of a house where love was measured by obedience to people who never saw me. My father, Charles, leaned against the porch rail with a beer in his hand, and when I tried to run forward to rescue one half-burned volume, he slapped me hard across the face. My mother, Linda, whispered only one sentence, the one that carved itself into me deeper than the slap. She said, "Rachel, you provoke her. You make things worse. You need to stop acting like the victim." In that moment, I realized no one in that house would ever stand beside me. I remember the sound of the crackling pages, the smell of scorched paper, the sting in my cheek, and the laughter of my sister Victoria as she threw the last book into the flames and said, "Let us see how far you go without these." At 19, I thought I had lost everything. For years, I carried that night in my chest like an open wound. Fast forward almost a decade. I am 28 years old now. I stand in the glass tower of a penthouse worth $20 million overlooking the endless movement of New York City. Behind me is a marble kitchen, a room filled with awards, and a life I built brick by brick without anyone in my family. Success has a strange taste when it comes from surviving betrayal. You want to celebrate, but you also want to look back at the ashes and remember the fire that started it all. This morning, when I opened the curtains and looked down at the busy street below, I saw something I never imagined. Sitting on the curb with her head bowed and her clothes stained with city dirt was Victoria, the same sister who set fire to my books, the same sister who told everyone I was worthless, was now outside begging strangers for money. For a moment, my breath caught in my throat, and I felt a sharp stab of memory. I heard her laughter again. I smelled the paper burning again, and I remembered the way I walked away from that house years ago with nothing but the clothes on my back. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the collision of past and present. There she was, the architect of my despair, now reduced to a figure of pity at the foot of the building I own. I whispered to myself, life has a way of turning pages. The irony was not lost on me. She burned my books and thought she had destroyed my story. Yet here she was, and here I was, and the ending she tried to write for me had turned into a prologue for something far greater. But do not mistake me. This is not a tale of sweet revenge served effortlessly. Between that night of burning books and this morning of marble floors lies a road of hunger, of humiliation, of battles fought alone, and of victories earned with tears and grit. I learned to sleep in my car. I learned to work until my hands bled. I learned to build something out of ruins when no one believed in me. And every single choice I made was haunted by the sound of those pages crackling in fire. That sound became the rhythm of my resolve. When I coded my first program at 3 in the morning on a borrowed laptop, I heard it. When I signed my first contract with trembling hands, I heard it. When investors finally shook my hand and called me a CEO, I heard it. And even now, when I watch her from the 22nd floor window, I hear it. You might think this is only a family drama, but it is not. It is a story about toxic love disguised as blood ties, about violence, dressed up as discipline, about control, masked as care. It is a story of walking away, not because you wanted to, but because staying meant death of the spirit. And it is about the long echo of that choice when years later the same people who pushed you down arrive at your door asking for the crumbs of your success. My hook is simple. She burned my books when I was 19. Today she begs outside my penthouse. What happened in between is the story I am about to tell you, and it is not clean, it is not easy, but it is true. Charleston looked beautiful on postcards with its cobblestone streets and painted houses, but inside our Dawson home, the walls absorbed more silence and criticism than laughter. My father, Charles Dawson, believed discipline meant control, and he carried his authority like a weapon. He was the kind of man who measured worth by achievements and obedience, and he made it clear that Victoria was the daughter who reflected his pride. My sister was 4 years older than me, glamorous, social, and skilled in manipulation. She could bring home a mediocre grade, and he would pat her shoulder saying she had charm that could open doors. I once brought home an A- in calculus, and he slammed the report card on the table, saying, "Rachel, you think life rewards almost perfect." It was never enough for him when it came to me. My mother, Linda, was the quiet shadow who hovered at the edges of every argument. She never raised her voice, yet her silence carried its own cruelty. She would whisper to me after Charles exploded, "Just stay quiet, Rachel. Do not make things worse." In her eyes, peace meant submission, and so she enabled the storms by never resisting. Dinner time in our house was a ritual of hierarchy. Charles sat at the head, Victoria beside him, and their conversations dominated while I often sat across from them, clutching my fork and feeling invisible. When I spoke about wanting to apply for scholarships to study literature or computer science, my father scoffed that practical skills like cooking or secretarial work would be more realistic for me. Victoria smirked, twirling her hair, and said, "Why waste money on Rachel's dreams when she cannot even make eye contact at family gatherings?" The table would erupt in small laughs, uncles and aunts visiting on weekends, all complicit in the casual dismissal. There was one summer evening when Aunt May came over with her ankle in a brace. I had driven 2 hours to pick her up from the hospital because no one else would, and she thanked me softly in the car. Yet later that evening, when Victoria accused me of seeking attention, Aunt May looked down into her iced tea and said nothing. Loyalty in our family flowed toward the person with the loudest voice and the cruelest confidence. Victoria perfected her role as the golden child. She wore designer dresses even when we struggled with bills, somehow convincing our parents that investing in her beauty was investing in the family's reputation. She floated through school events like a Southern debutante, shaking hands, smiling for photos, and whispering poison in everyone's ears about me. "Rachel is too emotional," she would say. "Rachel is always drifting. Rachel cannot handle real life." Those words echoed because they were repeated not just in gossip, but in my father's lectures and my mother's sighs. I became the leftover, the quiet one expected to endure ridicule as proof of resilience. When the family gathered for backyard barbecues, cousins catching up uncles drunk on cheap beer, I often stood at the corner holding a plastic cup, nodding, smiling, pretending I did not notice the way Victoria's laughter cut me like glass. She would say things loudly enough for everyone to hear. Still between jobs. "Rachel? Must be nice, all that free time." People would chuckle nervously, unwilling to confront her, unwilling to defend me. And every time I waited for my mother to step in to say enough, she stayed silent. My father would sip his drink and stare at the lawn like it owed him something. These gatherings taught me that isolation can happen even in crowded spaces. I was the ghost at my own family table, present in body, but erased in worth. When I tried to fight back, reminding them of the times I lent Victoria money when she was underwater on her mortgage, or when I helped my father fix the deck, the response was always twisted. "Stop acting like a martyr," Victoria would say. "You drift. You show up empty-handed. The family is tired of you." The phrase "the family" echoed through my mind because in that house I was never considered part of it. The phrase became a knife disguised as belonging. The only place I found relief was in my books. Stacks of second-hand textbooks lined the shelves in my small room, pages filled with notes, margins crowded with scribbles of hope. Each book felt like a step on a ladder out of the pit. I dreamed of leaving Charleston, of studying hard, of proving not just to them, but to myself that I was more than their scapegoat. And perhaps that was what enraged Victoria the most. She sensed that my escape route was intellectual, while hers was manipulation. My ambition threatened her reign as the center of attention. The more I studied, the more she mocked me, and the more she mocked me, the more determined I became. Yet determination without protection is fragile. I was 19, balancing part-time jobs, saving every tip in a jar labeled tuition while enduring constant dismissal at home. I still remember one night folding laundry when Victoria barged into my room holding one of my notebooks. She flipped through pages of equations and underlined sentences, and she sneered. "What kind of life are you writing here, Rachel? No one cares about your words." She tossed it back at me like garbage. That moment foreshadowed the bonfire that would later consume all my books. It was not just about paper. It was about control, about ensuring that I remained small enough for her to shine. Toxic families thrive on scapegoats because someone has to carry the weight of blame. in our home that someone was me. The more invisible I became, the more they felt secure. The irony was sharp because the very invisibility they forced on me became the seed of my resilience. Yet, at 19, I did not know that. I only knew the sting of exclusion, the sound of my father's disappointed sighs, the taste of humiliation when Victoria's friends whispered and laughed as she imitated my quiet voice at school functions. I carried all of it like stones in my pockets. By the time the night came when my books turned to ash in the backyard, I already understood that in the Dawson family, love was a currency I would never afford. The night my books were burned is etched into my memory with the clarity of fire against darkness. It was the middle of September humid air, thick with the scent of magnolia and sweat, and I had just returned from a late shift at the diner. My uniform still smelled of grease and coffee when I walked up the driveway and saw the glow in the backyard. At first, I thought it was a bonfire, maybe a family gathering, but then my heart dropped because the shape of the flames was too familiar. I ran closer and I saw them the spines of my textbooks, the pages curling, the words turning into smoke. Victoria stood with her arms crossed, her face illuminated by the blaze like some cruel queen of destruction. She held one last book in her manicured hand, my biology text that I had bought secondhand with 3 weeks of tips. She looked at me, smiled with her lips, but not her eyes, and said, "Let us see how smart you are without these." Then she tossed it into the fire and the flames swallowed it whole. I screamed, my voice cracking, and rushed forward to grab what I could. My fingers reached into the edges of the pit, and I pulled back, burned scraps that turned to ash in my palms. Before I could reach further, my father, Charles, stepped in front of me. He smelled of beer and anger, and without a word, he slapped me so hard across the cheek that my head spun. I staggered, my knees buckling, and the taste of blood filled my mouth. He said, "You need to toughen up. Rachel life will not be kind to the weak." Behind him, my mother Linda stood near the porch, clutching her hands together, her face pale. I looked at her with tears streaming down my face, begging with my eyes for her to intervene, but she whispered only one thing. "You provoke her. Rachel, you make her angry. You should stop playing the victim." Her words cut deeper than the slap. They told me that even my pain was my fault, that in this house my suffering would never be acknowledged as real. Victoria laughed, a sharp sound like glass breaking, and said to the relatives who lingered nearby, "See, she cannot even handle this. She is pathetic." A few cousins chuckled nervously, their eyes darting away, unwilling to take my side. I stood in the glow of that fire, realizing I was utterly alone. Every hour I had worked, every tip I had saved, every dream I had folded into the pages of those books was turning into smoke. My vision blurred with tears as I tried to salvage one charred cover, but it disintegrated in my hands. I felt something crack inside me. It was not just grief, it was a shattering recognition that my family did not want me to succeed, that my sister would rather see me destroyed than risk me rising above her. My father's slap echoed in my skull, and my mother's whispered blame coiled around my heart. The world tilted, and I saw clearly that this was not a family, this was a cage. The flames roared higher as if celebrating my defeat. Victoria stepped closer, her perfume mingling with the acrid smoke, and said quietly enough for only me to hear, "You will never leave this place. Rachel, because you have nothing now." I wanted to scream back, to claw at her, to throw myself into the fire, if only to prove I would not be erased. But my body betrayed me with weakness, my knees trembling, my voice locked in my throat. I stood there trembling while my books, my future, my hope turned into ash. The moment seared into me like a brand. I understood that night that I could not stay in that house, that if I stayed, I would be consumed like the pages. I felt a coldness settle into me, a seed of determination born not from inspiration, but from devastation. My father turned away, uninterested, and walked back to the porch as if nothing had happened. My mother followed him, her silence the loudest betrayal of all. Victoria smirked at me one last time, flicked her hair, and walked inside, leaving me alone with the smoking ruin of my dreams. I sank to my knees, the damp earth soaking into my jeans, and gathered ashes in my hands. The paper crumbled, staining my skin black. I whispered to myself, They cannot burn me. They cannot burn what I know. I whispered it again and again, a mantra against despair, though I was not sure I believed it. That night, I slept in my car, parked outside a 24-hour CVS, the flickering neon buzzing above me like a cruel reminder of instability. I stared at the cracked ceiling of my car and replayed the fire again and again. Each time I saw Victoria's smile, each time I heard my father's words, each time I felt my mother's silence. And each time I promised myself this would not be the end of me. It was the lowest point, the pit of humiliation and loss. But sometimes the pit is where the roots of resilience take hold. I did not know how I would survive, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I would not let the fire be the last chapter of my story. The morning after the fire, I packed my life into one duffel bag. There was not much to take, just a few clothes, a toothbrush, and a notebook that had been in my locker at work and so escaped the flames. The rest of my belongings smelled of smoke or carried the stain of betrayal. I walked through the kitchen where my mother stood making coffee. She looked at me with tired eyes and asked if I was really leaving. I told her yes, and she said nothing more, just stirred sugar into her cup. My father was in the living room watching the news, muttering about politics, ignoring me as if I were already gone. I waited for someone to say, "Stay," or "We are sorry," or even goodbye, but silence was the only response. I stepped out of that house, knowing it was not a home, and with every step down the driveway, I felt lighter and heavier at the same time. I drove aimlessly for hours until the gaslight blinked. I pulled into the parking lot of a grocery store and counted the money in my wallet. $47.23. That was my worth to the world in that moment. I ate a granola bar for dinner, reclined the seat, and tried to sleep. The night air seeped in through the cracked window, and the sound of delivery trucks rattling by kept me awake. I stared at the roof of my car and whispered to myself, "This is not forever." But forever is what it felt like. Over the next few weeks, I pieced together survival. I showered in the restroom at the diner before shifts, telling coworkers I had overslept and needed to freshen up. I ate leftover fries and half-finished sandwiches when the kitchen staff scraped plates. I kept my duffel bag in the trunk, moving from one parking lot to another so security guards would not chase me away. Every day was a blur of exhaustion and shame, yet in the cracks of that shame, a strange resilience began to grow. I realized that no one was coming to save me. The family that should have been my safety net had cut the ropes and watched me fall. If I wanted to climb out of the pit, I had to build my own ladder. I remember one particular night when rain hammered on the windshield and leaked through a crack in the seal. My blanket was damp, my stomach ached with hunger, and I cried harder than I ever had before. But then something inside me shifted. The tears dried and a quiet anger settled in. Not the kind of anger that lashes out, but the kind that fuels. I told myself, "Rachel, you will not die in this car. You will not let them be right about you. You will crawl, you will fight, you will rise." It became a vow. A week later, I found a tiny room advertised on a community board at the diner. It was barely more than a closet in an old boarding house, but the rent was cheap and the landlady asked no questions. I paid the first month with my tips and moved in with nothing but my duffel. The mattress sagged, the walls smelled of mildew, but it was a door that locked and a roof that held. For the first time in weeks, I slept without fear of being chased away. The next morning, I sat on the floor with a notebook and wrote down a plan. Step 1. Keep my job. Step 2. Save everything I could. Step 3. Find a way back into education with or without books. I had no roadmap, no guide, only a stubborn refusal to let my sister's fire define me. I began visiting the public library during my off hours, sitting at the back table scribbling notes from whatever books I could find. I felt small among the shelves, but also safe, as if the quiet hum of knowledge could shelter me from the chaos of my past. In those days, survival was not glamorous. It was eating ramen noodles for breakfast and dinner. It was sewing the same pair of jeans when they ripped because new clothes were out of reach. It was lying to coworkers about where I lived, smiling as if my life were not falling apart. But beneath the lies was the truth of a seed growing in soil scorched by fire. I had left home with nothing, yet in that nothingness there was room to grow. The pain was still raw, the betrayal still fresh, but I carried it like kindling. Someday I told myself I would ignite it in a different way. Someday the flames would belong to me. Opportunity did not arrive with a trumpet or a miracle. It came quietly in the form of an older man carrying a stack of books through the public library doors. I was hunched over a battered notebook copying passages by hand because I could not afford to check out certain volumes without proof of permanent residence when he stopped by my table. Professor Miller, his name stitched in memory forever, peered at me with a kind but curious gaze. He asked what I was working on, and embarrassed I tried to cover my pages. When I admitted I was just taking notes from whatever I could find, he tilted his head and said, "You remind me of one of my students." I told him I had been a student once, but that I had lost my chance. He sat across from me, set down his books, and asked me to tell him everything. For the first time in months, maybe years, someone listened. When I finished, he opened his bag and pulled out a worn but intact set of biology and math texts. "They are older editions," he said, "but they will serve." He pushed them across the table toward me as if they were priceless gifts, and to me, they were. That night in my cramped room, I opened those books and traced every word with trembling fingers. It felt like water to a starving throat. Professor Miller encouraged me to apply for a community college scholarship. At first, I scoffed, thinking I had no chance, but he insisted that drive counted as much as background. I spent nights filling out forms, rewriting essays, and submitting applications. The rejection letters came first sharp disappointments, but one envelope finally brought acceptance, partial aid that covered tuition if I could handle living expenses. It was not a full rescue, but it was a foothold. Around the same time, I met David Chin, a former classmate who recognized me while I was wiping tables at the diner. He was studying computer science at the university across town, and he asked me why I looked so tired. I hesitated, then told him pieces of my story. Instead of pity, he offered something unexpected. He said, "Rachel, you should learn to code." I laughed, thinking it was impossible, but he pulled out his laptop right there and showed me lines of code that looked like a foreign language. Still, something about it hooked me. It was structured logical, a place where effort produced results not dependent on anyone's approval. Over the next months, David lent me tutorials, cheap guides, and free resources. I worked double shifts at the diner and then sat in the library until closing, stumbling through syntax errors and endless frustration. At first, nothing worked. I could not make a program print a simple phrase without errors, but each small breakthrough felt monumental. The first time I ran a correct loop, I whispered to myself, "Take that, Victoria." I could still hear her laughter in my head, telling me I would never amount to anything, and every successful line of code was a defiance. The struggles were real. My eyes burned from sleepless nights, my hands ached from carrying trays, and sometimes I failed entire assignments. There were days I wanted to quit, to sink into despair, but that vow in the car returned to me. You will not let them win. And so, I pushed through. One evening, exhausted, I showed David a small inventory app I had managed to cobble together. He raised his eyebrows impressed and said, "This could actually be useful." For the first time, someone believed in me not out of sympathy but out of recognition of skill. That tiny program buggy as it was became the seed of something larger. In that glimmer of validation, I saw the outline of a future. Professor Miller had planted the seed with his books. David watered it with guidance, and my own stubbornness forced it to grow. The world was still hard, my meals still cheap noodles, my jeans still patched, but now I carried something they could not burn. I carried knowledge and the will to use it. The fire, my sister said, had taken away my pages, but it had not taken away my hunger, and that hunger began to turn into momentum. Success did not come as a sudden explosion. It arrived in small increments like dawn light slipping under a closed door. David and I kept refining the little inventory app, adjusting code after long nights in the library, testing it on his uncle's small warehouse business. The first time the system worked without crashing logging items and creating a simple schedule, we stared at the screen as if it were a miracle. His uncle agreed to pay a modest fee for continued use, barely enough to cover a month of rent, but to me, it felt like winning a lottery. I had earned money with my mind, not just my hands, and that validation was priceless. With that payment, I moved out of the boarding house into a tiny studio above a laundromat. The walls were thin, the radiator hissed, and trains rattled past the window at night, but it was mine. I bought a small desk from a thrift store and placed Professor Miller's old textbooks on it like sacred relics. Every morning before work, I touched their spines and reminded myself that no one could take this from me now. At the diner, I still served tables, still carried heavy trays, but my posture changed. I was no longer just a waitress. I was a builder, a learner, a creator. Customers who snapped their fingers or barked orders could no longer diminish me because I carried a secret power. I was building something beyond their sight. Months passed and the app grew stronger. Word spread among small businesses, and David and I installed versions in 2 more warehouses. The payments were small but steady, and for the first time in my life, I could pay bills without fear of eviction. The day I cleared my last overdue utility notice, I cried alone in my room, tears of relief rather than despair. I began to walk with a sense of quiet pride, not the arrogance of my sister, but the dignity of survival turned into progress. Then came a moment I will never forget. A local newspaper ran a feature on community innovation and included a short article about our app. The headline read, "From Homeless Student to Startup Hope." Seeing my name in print next to that story felt surreal. I clipped the article and pinned it to my wall. It was proof that the world saw me differently than my family had. It was proof that my voice mattered. The recognition, though small, gave me courage to apply for a modest startup grant. I wrote the proposal by hand at first, then typed it carefully, detailing our goals and the potential to expand into logistics. Weeks later, when the acceptance email arrived awarding us $5,000, I nearly dropped the laptop in shock. $5,000 meant equipment software licenses, the ability to quit one of my 2 shifts, and dedicate more time to building. I sent David a frantic message, and we celebrated with cheap pizza, laughing until midnight about how this was only the beginning. That laughter was different from the cruel mockery of my sister. It was genuine, shared healing. Slowly but surely, my life began to transform. I no longer measured worth by surviving another day, but by building toward another horizon. Each small client, each line of improved code, each conversation with people who respected my work added a brick to a foundation that once had been ashes. My heart still carried scars. The memory of the fire still haunted my dreams. But those scars became fuel rather than chains. And in the quiet of my studio, as trains rattled by, I whispered to myself that this was only the first step. The fire had not destroyed me. It had forged me. Momentum gathered like a tide that could no longer be held back. Our small app grew into a platform as David and I poured every waking hour into development. Investors who once ignored my emails began to respond after they saw local businesses praising our system. The day we pitched to a regional logistics firm, I wore a second-hand blazer that was slightly too big. My palms sweaty, but I spoke with conviction. When the executives nodded and asked for a pilot program, I felt a surge of validation stronger than any applause. Within 6 months, the pilot turned into a full contract, and soon venture capital noticed. Sitting across from men in tailored suits, I expected dismissal, but instead they leaned forward, intrigued by the simplicity and practicality of our design. They asked about leadership, and without hesitation, David said, "Rachel is the CEO." My breath caught because for so long I had been called nothing useless trash. To hear CEO attached to my name felt like a rewriting of reality. With funding secured, we moved into a real office, small but buzzing with energy, and hired a handful of employees. I treated each one with respect. I had long been denied listening to their ideas, remembering their birthdays, making sure no one felt invisible. As our company expanded, I signed papers that once would have terrified me, contracts worth millions, partnerships with international firms. With every deal, I remembered the night of the fire and the vow I had made not to let them win. Each signature was a defiance. I began traveling to conferences, standing on stages with bright lights and large screens, speaking about innovation born from adversity. One journalist asked if my background influenced my drive, and I answered without hesitation. Family is not who raises you, it is who respects you. That quote spread online like wildfire, printed on mugs, posted on social media, turned into a mantra for people who had survived their own toxic ties. My words had become bigger than me. With success came wealth beyond anything I imagined. I purchased a penthouse in New York, glass walls overlooking the city, marble floors gleaming beneath my feet. When I first stepped inside, I thought of the ashes that had once coated my hands, and I whispered, "This is mine." I filled the space with reminders of my journey: framed articles, old notebooks, even a small jar of charred paper remnants I had salvaged from the fire placed on a shelf as a monument. The irony was sharp and satisfying. My sister had tried to burn my future, and here I was, standing in luxury built from the very flames she ignited. Yet despite the wealth, I did not change my habits entirely. I still cooked simple meals, eggs and toast, eaten standing by the stove. I still worked late into the night reviewing lines of code writing plans. Money had not erased the memory of hunger. It had sharpened my gratitude. At the peak of my rise, I received invitations to galas, panels, interviews. Strangers congratulated me, employees looked to me for guidance, investors praised my vision, but beneath the applause lingered the echo of absence. My family had never called, never written, never asked. They had cut me off as if I had never existed, and part of me still carried the ache of that rejection. Yet in that ache was also triumph, because I had proven them wrong. I had built an empire from ashes. I had risen not because of them, but in spite of them. And as I stood on my balcony overlooking the city lights, wind rushing through my hair, I felt both the weight of solitude and the thrill of independence. This was the peak I had dreamed of, and it was mine alone. It happened on a crisp autumn morning when the city hummed with its usual rhythm of horns and footsteps. I had just finished a call with a potential European partner when the intercom buzzed. The doorman's voice came through, hesitant, saying there were 2 women downstairs asking for me by name. I almost dismissed it as fans or journalists until he added the names: Linda and Victoria Dawson. My body went cold. 9 years had passed without a word, and now they were at the foot of my building. Against my better judgment, I allowed them up, curiosity outweighing caution. When the elevator doors opened, I saw my mother looking, older lines etched into her face, her eyes tired but still holding that same unreadable silence. Beside her stood Victoria, dressed sharply, though her heels were scuffed, her smile rehearsed. She stepped forward as if nothing had happened and said, "Rachel, it has been far too long. We are family, and family should reconnect." Her voice was honey, but her eyes scanned the penthouse behind me with hunger. I let them in, but did not move from the doorway until they passed. Victoria walked through the living room slowly, fingers brushing along the furniture, her gaze lingering on the view from the glass walls. She whistled softly and said, "This place is stunning. You have really made something of yourself." My mother lowered herself into a chair without asking, exhaling as if the weight of years pressed down on her. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Victoria began her performance. "Things have been difficult," she said, her tone carefully measured. "The economy, the housing crisis, you know how it is." I listened silently, arms folded. Finally, she dropped the act of small talk. "We lost the house, Rachel. We need somewhere to stay just for a little while until we get back on our feet." She smiled brightly as if expecting me to melt. My stomach twisted at the audacity. The same sister who burned my books, who mocked me, who erased me, now wanted a bed in the home I had built from the ashes she created. I asked, why now? Why, after 9 years of silence? Victoria leaned forward, resting her manicured hands on her knees, and said, "Because blood is blood. We may have fought, but we are still family." My mother nodded faintly as if echoing her. I almost laughed at the absurdity. For years they had abandoned me, dismissed me, left me to starve and struggle. Now they wanted sanctuary. I stared at Victoria and saw through the veneer. Her clothes were fashionable but slightly frayed, her makeup thick enough to hide sleepless nights. My mother's purse looked worn, her shoes cracked. They were desperate, and desperation had brought them to my door. I could feel the air tighten with unspoken truths. I thought of the nights in my car, the ramen dinners, the endless hours coding while their voices of disdain echoed in my head. And now here they were, expecting forgiveness wrapped in luxury. I told them I needed time to think. Victoria smiled too quickly, as if victory were assured. Of course, she said, we understand. A few weeks, Rachel, no pressure. As they left, Victoria gave my shoulder a light pat, a parody of affection, while my mother avoided my eyes. I closed the door behind them and pressed my back to the wood, my chest heaving. My penthouse felt colder, my success invaded. That night, I sat on the balcony staring at the city lights, wrestling with fury and disbelief. They had returned not with apologies or accountability, but with expectations. They wanted to rewrite history by stepping into my present, as if the past never burned. And deep down, I knew this was not about family. It was about survival, theirs at the cost of mine. At first, their presence was subtle, like fog creeping through cracks. But within days, Victoria and my mother began to settle, as if the penthouse were theirs. They unpacked bags without asking, stocked the fridge with cheap groceries that clashed with my routines, and draped their belongings across the guest rooms. I told myself to stay calm, to watch, to calculate, because anger without strategy is wasted. But every night, the memories of the fire clawed back when I saw Victoria sipping wine on my couch, laughing, as if she had never called me pathetic. My mother cooked once and served it with a smile that felt like guilt disguised as generosity, but she avoided any conversation about the past. They wanted me to swallow years of betrayal for the price of temporary peace. One evening, I hosted colleagues for dinner, important potential partners, and Victoria inserted herself into the gathering with forced charm. Midway through the meal, she leaned back, swirling her glass, and said loudly, "It is funny how Rachel always acted like a martyr even back in the day. She never really pulled her weight." The table grew tense. I clenched my jaw, the humiliation sharp as ever, but this time I did not crumble. Instead, I excused myself, calmly, walked to my study, and returned with a remote. With one click, the large screen on the wall lit up, projecting security footage from a week earlier. The video showed Victoria sneaking into my office, rifling through drawers, slipping my credit card into her purse. Gasps circled the table. My mother froze. Victoria's smile cracked, and I let the footage play twice before turning off the screen. I looked directly at her and said, "This is who my sister really is." Silence weighed heavy. Victoria stammered, "That is not what it looks like," but her voice lacked conviction. My colleagues excused themselves politely, shaken but respectful, and as soon as the door shut behind them, I called my attorney. Within hours, legal papers were drawn, accusing Victoria of theft and fraud. When I confronted her with the documents, she screamed, "You cannot do this. We are family." I answered coldly, "Family does not burn your future and call it love." The words hit like steel. My mother wept quietly, begging me to reconsider, but I had spent years reconsidering while starving in cars and working double shifts. Now I was done. I pressed charges, forcing the issue into the public eye. Victoria tried to twist the narrative, leaking edited clips to the media, portraying me as abusive, raising my voice, arms lifted as if threatening. Within hours, the video spread online, captioned "Tech CEO in domestic dispute." My stomach dropped, rage and fear colliding, but I was not the powerless girl at 19 anymore. I had prepared for betrayal. Paranoia born from scars had made me smart. I had backups of every camera feed uncut with clear audio showing Victoria and my mother plotting. One clip in particular sealed their fate. It captured Victoria pacing the guest room whispering, "If we cut it right, no one will care if it is fake. We just need her to look angry." My mother's tired voice replied, "She is too soft. She will not fight back." I saved every file, timestamped, watermarked, and forwarded them to my attorney, my publicist, and trusted media contacts. By morning, the narrative flipped. Headlines screamed false abuse claim backfires. Extortion attempt caught on tape. Public sympathy surged toward me, and comments flooded with praise. "Always document," one read, "respect to the quiet ones who do not flinch." My reputation not only survived, it strengthened. Investors called with reassurance, employees rallied with pride, and the world saw Victoria not as a victim, but as a manipulator exposed. When the police arrived to escort her out, she shrieked at me, "You think you are above us, Rachel, but you are nothing without family." I stared at her steadily and replied, "You tried to erase me, but all you did was teach me how to fight." The officers led her away, her protests echoing down the hallway. My mother remained behind, eyes hollow, whispering, "We never meant it to go this far." But intent does not erase harm, and harm repeated becomes choice. I told her quietly, "You stood silent when she burned my books. You stood silent when she stole, and silence is complicity." She lowered her head and left without another word. That night, I walked the hall past the shelf where I kept the jar of ashes. Beside it, I placed the signed legal documents, the proof of her crime side by side with the ruins of my books. Past and present, fused scar and justice aligned. I poured a glass of water, stood on the balcony, and breathed the cool night air. For the first time in years, I felt not just survival, but victory. The revenge was not violent. It was precise, public, undeniable. The girl who once begged for mercy in front of flames had become the woman who set boundaries in marble and glass, and the world had witnessed the truth. The days that followed felt like the slow settling of dust after a violent storm. News outlets replayed the footage again and again, analysts dissecting the failed scheme, commentators praising the evidence I had preserved. Victoria faced charges of theft and attempted fraud. Her name dragged across tabloids not as the glamorous figure she once portrayed, but as a cautionary tale. Court hearings moved forward swiftly, her attorney scrambling to negotiate a deal, but the damage to her reputation was irreversible. My mother stood by her at first, sitting quietly in the courtroom, her head bowed, but even she seemed worn down by the undeniable clarity of the recordings. My father, Charles, never appeared, though I heard through distant relatives that his health had declined. Not once did he call, not once did he write. The silence was consistent to the end. Victoria received community service fines and a permanent mark on her record. To me, the punishment was not measured only in legal terms, but in the collapse of the image she had built for years. The woman who once stood over a fire mocking me was now shunned, pitied, and exposed. After the trial, she attempted to contact me, sending messages through acquaintances, but I never responded. Some wounds do not need conversations, they need closure, and I already had mine. My mother wrote a letter on yellowed paper pleading for forgiveness, reminding me that family ties are unbreakable. I read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the same drawer where I kept the ashes of my books. Forgiveness in words did not erase the decades of silence. I chose not to answer. Instead, I focused on what I could build beyond revenge. Wealth gave me power, but meaning gave me peace. I established a scholarship fund called Dawson Future, designed for students estranged from their families, young people cast aside who needed a second chance. Each award letter carried the message, "They cannot burn your future." The first time I met a recipient, a shy young woman holding her acceptance paper with trembling hands, I saw in her eyes the reflection of my 19-year-old self. It was then I understood that healing did not come only from exposing my family, but from ensuring that others could escape similar fires. Inside my penthouse, I left one wall bare, except for a framed display containing the charred remains of a single book I had managed to salvage from the flames. The edges were blackened, the text barely visible, but it hung there as a symbol of what was taken and what was reclaimed. Visitors often asked why I did not repair it or replace it. I always answered, because scars tell the truth. The scar reminded me daily that destruction had been real, but survival had been stronger. Life moved forward with a strange new rhythm. Investors continued to support the company, employees flourished under leadership that valued them, and my voice was sought in conversations about resilience and leadership. Yet at night alone on the balcony, I still sometimes whispered to the girl in the car under the buzzing light of a CVS. I told her she had done well, that she had not been erased, that she had turned ashes into architecture. That dialogue between past and present became my quiet ritual. Months later, I heard Victoria had left the city, drifting from place to place, unable to regain footing. My mother moved in with a distant cousin, living quietly out of the public eye. My father's condition worsened, and eventually news of his passing reached me through a brief message from an uncle. I did not attend the funeral. I had already buried the version of him that mattered the night he slapped me for trying to save my books. Instead, I lit a candle in my apartment, placed it near the window, and whispered goodbye to the possibility of a father I never had. Closure does not always come with graveside ceremonies. Sometimes it comes with finally acknowledging the absence. In the years that followed, I hosted dinners with friends, colleagues, and scholarship recipients. My dining table filled with laughter that once never existed at my family gatherings. One evening, an intern I had mentored stood and told a story of how I had given him 2 weeks paid leave when his father died, insisting he take time to heal. He said softly, "That saved me." Around the table, silence fell, and in that silence, I realized I had created a family chosen not by blood, but by presence, loyalty, and respect. That was the justice that mattered most. On quiet nights, I still looked at the cracked book on my wall and the jar of ashes on the shelf. I touched the glass and felt no bitterness, only recognition. They thought they could burn my future, but all they did was light a fire I never let die. The city outside roared with sirens and lights, but inside my home there was peace. True peace. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of freedom. I sipped a glass of wine, stood at the window, and let the reflection of the skyline remind me that every scar had shaped the woman standing here. The girl who once walked away with nothing but a duffel bag had built a life beyond imagination. And as I turned away from the window, the sound of the door closing softly behind me carried the weight of an ending I had long awaited.